Hello and welcome to Gegenpressing. I'm Manufred, he's Stefan Bienkowski, and today's big topic is, of course, Thomas Tuchel and Bayern Munich's announcement that he is going to leave the club. Drum roll, not immediately, but in the summer. Stefan, first thoughts here. Is this going to appease the Bayern Munich fans?
It feels very much like that was what it was designed to do. It doesn't really solve any of Bayern's immediate problems because he's still at the club. And like I said on Twitter, I'm not sure it solves any of the long-term problems either. We've been talking about this on show after show. We've been doing our best to talk about anything but Bayern Munich, to be perfectly honest with you, this week, but we keep coming back to it.
Difficult.
It's an interesting one because, like I said on Twitter, I think replacing Tuchel's probably the easiest thing Bayern could do to appease their fans. I think there's a deeper problem that has to be, dealt with within that squad. In my newsletter this week, I wrote a lot about how Kimmich and Goretzka have really fallen off in terms of their stats over the last couple of seasons. Both of them turned 29 this month. They're not spring chickens anymore. They're probably not players that Bayern can really build their teams around anymore. And, as our subscribers said in the comments below, that Bayern midfield is a far cry from the players they had before, Schweinsteiger, Thiago Alcantara, Javi Martinez, players like that. So Xabi Alonso himself, actually, who I'm sure we're going to talk about. Long story short, there's much bigger issues in that squad, I think. In fact, another thing I noticed, which I was quite startled at when I wrote the breaking news for Transfermarkt today on this, was that I hadn't checked all season, but Bayern actually have the third oldest squad in the Bundesliga this year. There's a lot of kind of dead wood in that team, still relying on a lot of kind of senior players. So, I think there are bigger questions that Bayern will have to kind of address in the summer. And I think the way things have gone this season, the question was just whether they were going to do that with or without Thomas Tuchel. And they've decided to move on from Thomas Tuchel. They've worded it quite interestingly. I don't have it in front of me anymore, but I think they decided the word was they decided to end their partnership or their relationship, their professional relationship or whatever it is. So, Tuchel kind of goes off and finds somewhere else to do, and I think it makes a lot of sense because, we've been seeing a lot of the reporting one way or another that he wasn't happy with the squad he had. Seems to be butting heads a lot with the hierarchy of the club, and I guess something had to be done, and this is what they chose to do.
Yeah, I think it buys them time ultimately, right? As I mentioned in the bonus show last week, and as I wrote in my article for Gegenpressing too, this was never just about Thomas Tuchel. The issues at the club go much deeper than just the head coach. This is now the third high-profile German head coach who has struggled with this team. Right, at some point you have to maybe draw a line and say, well, maybe it isn't just about coaching. Having said all that, the deeper question then is, what do you do with this team? What are the next steps that you go? You're quite right pointing out that a lot of players in the squad probably need changing, and there needs to be a rebuild, and that's essentially why they brought in Christoph Freund, right, as the new sporting director. Having said all that, I also don't think you make that decision with the next piece in your puzzle in place, and that is the new director of sport. And if you wonder what the difference between the sporting director and director of sport in the German club is, Matt Ford and I broke this all down in a bonus show on Max Eber joining Bayern Munich on Gegenpressing. So for more details on that there. But ultimately, without Max Eber being confirmed on the board as the new director of sport, you do not decide the long-term role of your current head coach, or you do not bring in a new head coach. And I think that buys them time until Eber is in place and can sort of assess the situation. Ultimately, maybe I think that what happened here is that Tuchel himself probably realized that regardless of what comes next under Eber, there wasn't a future for him with this team. Joshua Kimmich falling out after the Bochum game with his assistant Scholt Löw, who was sort of the diplomatic link between Kimmich and Tuchel in the first place, indicates that relationship is now utterly broken. Bild reported last week that, amongst other players that were no longer in favor of continuing with Thomas Tuchel was Thomas Müller. And when Thomas Müller lowers his thumb on a head coach, you are done at the Sebener Straße. There is no return for you. So I think he too maybe realized that the writing was on the wall, no matter what Eberl decides. So I think this just buys them time to find a new head coach to take over in the summer. I personally think, before we get to the discussion of who could be the next head coach, and there's one name that's on everyone's lips, and we'll get to that. I actually wonder if Tuchel gets to the summer with this Bayern squad, right? Because one or two more bad results, and this question starts over again on whether he is the right head coach. And I think then even without a possible interims coach available, his immediate future at Bayern might be at stake as well.
Yeah, there's been reports from Sky Sports that Ole Gunnar Solskjaer is waiting in the wings to become interim head coach for the rest of the season, which has bizarre implications considering his history with Bayern Munich in the Champions League in particular, which is probably the one of the last competitions we're still in. That was one of the kind of points I made actually when the news broke on social media, that A, sacking him's the easy thing, but B, it's a little peculiar that they are keeping him on. I mean, you're absolutely spot on. It does kind of keep the boat steady. It means they can plan for the summer without having to worry about bringing someone in. But it also leaves a very unique situation where things could get worse, where he continues to fall out with players. They continue to get poorer performances in Champions League and in the Bundesliga. Or the flip side of that is, in a very Thomas Tuchel way, they could actually end up getting to a Champions League final or winning the Champions League, because now that the players in the squad have near enough nothing left to play for. Once the head coach has been sacked or been told he's leaving, all expectation, all pressure for these players just suddenly kind of evaporates from their shoulders. And I don't think it'd be on the realms of possibility that Tuchel could bizarrely kind of take this team to a Champions League final, which would be a very Thomas Tuchel thing to do, to kind of get to a final or win a Champions League and then get chucked out the back door of the club because he's pissed off too many people. But yeah, it still all kind of leads to the very great uncertainty as to what's happening this summer. And as you said, there's so many kind of names linked with the job, but one in particular is obviously Xabi Alonso. Today, as we talk about this, on the day that the club decided to announce it, very, very, very strong reporting from Germany saying that Xabi Alonso's the number one pick. He's the head coach they've always wanted, and that Xabi Alonso himself's desperate for the job. And I must admit, I'm kind of struggling to kind of fall in line with that, to be honest, because, I went to a Leverkusen early in the season, interviewed Xabi Alonso, spoke to a lot of people at the club. A lot of people very high up in the club who know exactly what he wants and what his plans are for the coming years. And at the time, it was Real Madrid who were being very heavily linked with him. And it was Real Madrid who were the incessant reporting was suggesting that, Alonso was on the verge of moving to them. And what everyone at Leverkusen told me was that, look, Xabi Alonso knows Real Madrid will wait for him. They know that he can move there when he's ready to move there. He can make his own decisions. And that's exactly what Alonso will do at the end of the day. And Bayern are now the third kind of super club this season alone who have come along and reportedly said, yep, we'll have some of that. Thanks, Xabi. Let us know when you want to join. Just sign the dotted line. We'll do everything else. And I think they'll probably be the third coach to be told, or third club rather, to be told that Alonso is quite happy at Leverkusen. He's in the middle of a very important project. And, if I'm being perfectly honest with you, if he goes on and wins the Bundesliga this season with Leverkusen, I can absolutely see him moving on. But I think of those three clubs, I just think Bayern are probably the least likely to sign him, simply because I think Liverpool and Real Madrid are further ahead with their rebuilds. And if he wins the Bundesliga with Leverkusen, I do kind of wonder what the grand appeal for him is to then go to Bayern to win the Bundesliga, because if his hopes are to kind of do something in the Champions League, he's got a very good Leverkusen side there which he could have a go at. Or of course you could move on to Liverpool or Real Madrid. So I'm not saying it's unlikely. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying that I struggle to see why, of all the options that Alonso has before him, and one of them certainly is staying at Leverkusen, why Bayern Munich would be the standout one amongst them all.
Yeah, I mean, you and I both have spent lots of time with Leverkusen. In fact, we had Simon Rolfes, Xabi Alonso's boss, on this very podcast before, right? So, I think we're quite in tune with what's going on with the Werkself, and I get a similar impression that you do. In fact, the Süddeutsche Zeitung today, a newspaper that's really close to Bayern Munich and very well informed, pointed out these things as well and saying, well, at the end of the day, Alonso seems really happy and content at Leverkusen, and the Leverkusen bosses seem quite confident that he's going nowhere. In fact, both Rolfes and Rudi Völler have made public statements saying that they sense that Alonso is very happy. He lives in Düsseldorf, right, which is one of the most livable cities in Germany. So, family is very content. I think his kids are very established in Germany as well because of the time that he spent with Bayern Munich, which is, of course, then also, I think, actually a factor of maybe Bayern Munich being slightly ahead of Liverpool. But that's a completely different discussion, right? I think that at the moment, because as I look at on Twitter or Threads or whatever social media you're using, there's a lot of fighting between Liverpool and Bayern fans. And I think at the moment they're completely ignoring the fact that there's a third team in Leverkusen that are probably holding the upper hand in all of this in regards of Alonso's immediate decision. So, leave your fighting aside because neither one of you might get him in the end, which then, of course, leaves the question of who else could be joining Bayern Munich. I have a few candidates in mind. Zinedine Zidane is one that's been heavily linked, and I think is actually pretty realistic. Ole Gunnar Solskjaer would make me laugh, to be honest, because of the history, and I don't think he has the reputation needed to coach this club. Sebastian Hoeneß is one that intrigues me, but I think there is the same kind of issues that you see with Alonso, right? That he's quite happy in Stuttgart and with the project there, and maybe doesn't seem quite ready yet to come back to Munich, the place he was born. And then you had another interesting option, Stefan.
Yeah, maybe once just to kind of cheer everyone up. I mean, it's by all means a very speculative suggestion, but when I was thinking about it this afternoon, who could be the next head coach at Bayern, I did think maybe they go back to the guy who they replaced with Thomas Tuchel, in Julian Nagelsmann. And there's a few reasons why that actually might be possible. The first one is that the people who sacked Julian Nagelsmann, quite disgracefully, it must be said, and that was kind of widely berated in the German press when he was sacked, the way he was sacked on his holidays. Those people are now gone. Oliver Kahn was sacked. Salihamidzic was sacked. The club have a new sporting director, a new director of football, a whole new hierarchy at the club, to be perfectly honest with you. So if Nagelsmann was to be approached by Bayern, they could feasibly say, such as Max Eberl, who, as you said, is coming into the club, could feasibly say, look, the guys who were your bosses last time are long gone. It's a different Bayern. We're trying to start a new era here. That's all water under the bridge. Let's start from scratch here. So there's that aspect to it. And the other thing as well is that Bayern could probably take a look at the last kind of 24 months and think maybe what Nagelsmann was doing was actually exactly what should have happened. He was beginning to rebuild his team. He was trying to implement new systems, new tactics. He was trying to move away from certain players, certain over-reliance on certain players. And he was doing perfectly well in the Champions League. Of course, that first season, he got knocked out by Villarreal, but they sacked him when he was unbeaten in the competition. And I think if Thomas Tuchel has proved anything, it is that the squad that Nagelsmann, or he inherited from Nagelsmann, simply wasn't up to the task of being a Bayern Munich team in the sense that of dominating the Bundesliga and challenging in the Champions League. In fact, Tuchel, as you said at the start of this video, is the third German head coach who's had to go at it and struggled, to be perfectly honest with you. So there's that as well. And simply the third one is that, he'll be looking to move on to a bigger club, or a club rather, after a stint with Germany this summer. And unless someone like Liverpool were to take an opportunity on him, or Barcelona maybe, who, as we've kind of said, or seems to be reported, are looking elsewhere at other head coaches such as Alonso or Hansi Flick himself. Bayern may be one of the few options Nagelsmann has. So it would be very odd. It'd be very unlikely, but I don't think it would be the stupidest idea from Bayern or Nagelsmann, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that that's your suggestion. I know that when Tuchel, at the end of last season, I had a source that I trust tell me that Nagelsmann was actually in the discussion of returning to Bayern Munich among the hierarchy, because, they said, well, if Tuchel isn't the right guy, we can go back to the guy who's still under contract. Of course, Nagelsmann is no longer under contract. He is now under contract at the DFB, but I think Bayern still pay a big part of those wages, if I'm not mistaken. So, I think it'd be quite easy for them to, and maybe make that financially happen. I'm not sure Julian himself is that keen, because I think his pride was hurt by, not that he was sacked, but the matter it happened because he found out through social media, right? Essentially that he was gone, and that maybe might be an obstacle here. I don't know. I think this is going to be one of the primary tasks for Max Eberl once he does get appointment to find the right solution here. And what is without a doubt, and I wrote this in my article on Thomas Tuchel last week, this has to be a decision that they have to get right. No matter what happens next, this is a strategic, important decision that they cannot get wrong. Because, whether it was Flick or Nagelsmann or Tuchel, this is now 3 coaches in a row that have gone prematurely, and they need some sort of long-term stability, and that is going to be paramount for this club. So they have to get this right. And I think that is going to be the interesting thing to follow and see if they can do it. Stefan, I think that's probably wraps it up, unless you have a final point to add.
No, I was just going to say it's actually now 5 head coaches at Bayern in a row since Guardiola who've left before their contract expired. Ancelotti, Kovac, Flick, Nagelsmann, and of course Tuchel, and a string of sporting directors, directors of sport, presidents, chief executives coming and going. As you said, the club over the course of the last 7-8 years has actually been quite, chaotic, if you will, and that's before we even start talking about the money they've spent in the transfer windows. So you're absolutely right. The thing they have to get sorted this summer is some sort of long-term plan to kind of make sure that all of this on and off the pitch begins to settle down.
Yeah, they need to calm things down. For more on this, check out the Gegenpressing, the new podcast and newsletter. You have a great piece, as you mentioned, on Kimmich and Goretzka. I wrote something on Tuchel last week. I think that is quite relevant. We also did a video on Alonso, so check that out. And then, of course, we discussed Max Eberl and his future role on a special bonus podcast as well. That's also on the Substack. I did that with Matt Ford, so go check all of that out. We'll be back soon with more content. Until then, auf Wiedersehen.